Hello and welcome to this video. Today I wanted to talk about dispensationalism, its sort of origins with a man called John Nelson Darby, and we'll be looking at himself and sort of the ideas he made, and perhaps looking at how they have maybe influenced some of the ideas of today. So we'll first start with who John Nelson Darby was. Well, he was the leader of this Christian sect known as the Plymouth Brethren. He was raised as in the Church of Ireland, so it's I believe an Anglican, it's a Protestant church, and the Plymouth Brethren, this sort of break-off sect that he made himself, would have been Protestant as well. I believe it is low Protestant as well. So this would mean a less focus on sort of tradition, typical church worship and things like that, and more about, I guess, communication and talking about, theology and prayer, and focus on that rather than on these sort of sacraments. But that's not entirely important. So yeah, he's credited with creating Secret Rapture, which in itself is a whole other topic, as well as forming this idea of dispensationalism. So what is dispensationalism? Well, dispensationalism is this framework on how to interpret the Bible. So it tells you, okay, this part here, this is how you should be understanding it. This part here, this is how you should be understanding it, right? So it's this sort of narrative in a way, understanding the narrative, right? But what it actually sort of posits, right? So the actual framework that it holds is that biblical history is divided into these ages. We call these dispensations, where God interacts with people in different ways. So what does that really mean? Well, it'll sort of divide history, right? So we've got the time of Noah, the time of, I guess, Adam as well, the time of Abraham, the time of Moses, and then the time of Jesus. And it separates these. Yep, so we've got that part down. And then it'll say that, well, God interacts with his people in different ways during this time. So with Abraham, he makes these promises, these covenants, and they're sort of kept with him. They're sort of stuck in this time almost with the people of that time or whatever, right? And it doesn't really have much of bearing on anyone else after. So God is he has a different relationship with his people during each of these dispensations, right? That's an important point to note. And this is quite a difference from the sort of typical Catholic and Orthodox view, which is that of covenant theology. So covenant theology, that would state that, okay, well, we have those covenants that we talked about with Noah, with, I guess, Adam as well, with Abraham, with Moses, and so on. And okay, so God has these promises, and he fulfills them through Jesus, right? So they're fulfilled in this way. Whereas with dispensationalism, it says, no, these are all separate. These are all separate, right? And this is not just me saying it, we can find this in Darby's own writings. And another thing to note is that this is not hidden information. This is all out there, right? There's been many texts written on this matter. If you go to the Plymouth Brethren church website itself, you can find this sort of database on Darby's writings. I believe it's all there. You can also find sort of older texts, which sort of have collated all of his writings as well. But anyway, if we go to the second paragraph, it states that in every instance there was total and immediate failure as regarded man. However, the patience of God might tolerate and carry on by grace. The dispensation in which man has thus failed in the outset and further, that there is no instance of the restoration of a dispensation afforded us, though there might be partial revivals of it through faith. So especially to note is that this line here, that there is no instant of a restoration of a dispensation afforded us. So it's sort of stating that, this dispensation, once it's sort of failed, that's it. There's nothing, right? It's done. It's separating, it's showing us that there is a distinction between each dispensation, right? There's no restoration. Each of these are separate. There's separate interaction between God and his people. So that's going to be a sort of important thing to keep in mind in terms of Darby's ideology. And we can see that this sort of tracks with our next sort of ideas from Darby, which is that the Bible has these two messages, one for Israel and one for the church. Now again, this is very different from the Catholic and Orthodox view. I'm not too familiar with Protestants, but perhaps some of them share this view as well. But it is that, Israel, that is talked about in the Bible, the promise to Israel is fulfilled through the church. The church of today is Israel, right? All the promises, all the covenants, that is fulfilled through Jesus and his establishment of this church. That's how it's sort of almost meant to be interpreted, right? That's a whole other topic to look at, dispensationalism versus covenant theology. We'd have to look through scripture and things like that. So if there's an interest in that, I might go through that topic. But for now, I'll just state the two positions, and you can determine sort of or figure out on your own which one is more coherent. So anyway, we can see here that in this sort of specific quote, as regards the unparalleled tribulation in Matthew 24 and the passages from which that is taken, it is exclusively Jewish. So again, this sort of exclusivity. The Jews are this sort of special people group that are going to have this sort of separate treatment, right? Whether good or bad, it's a separate treatment rather than the typical interpretation, which is that with Jesus' coming, there's no longer Jew or Gentile. We sort of all are incorporated into the covenant blessings in a way, right? Jesus died for all man's sins, not just for the Jews or whatever, right? So this is an important statement to note, in which Darby sort of believes that there is some exclusivity towards the Jewish people group, right? Okay, so yeah, again, that's going to have an impact on things like Christian Zionism and American evangelical churches, which has sort of been everywhere in the sort of political zeitgeist today. Pre-trib rapture. So that's the sort of topic that I sort of mentioned at the start. I would go through this today, and I haven't really looked at it because I found it to not be as important in linking with Christian Zionism too much. However, there is sort of an important element to it. So to briefly go through it, rapture sort of describes this sort of end times eschatology, end times sort of revelation, stuff like that, looking at, what's happening towards the end of the world. And, Darby and other sort of Bible literalists, so they actually believe that, what was discussed in the Bible will literally happen. There will literally be a sort of people being flying up into heaven or whatever is described in the rapture. So that is very influential in these evangelical churches. You might remember, you might not, but Harold Camping, and sort of I forgot what it's called, Y2K events and things like that, the sort of turmoil around that, these sort of ideas of end times in the millennium come from these sort of 19th century sort of authors and theologians, notably of which is Darby. Another topic that's going to be really important is some of the changes to the Bible that Darby made. Well, I say some, but there's actually a numerate amount. But for now, I've only looked at about 2. So, Darby produced his own version, his own translation of the New Testament. And if we look here, what then is the superiority of the Jew? Or what the profit of circumcision? So this is directly from Darby's translation. You can find this on Bible Gateway. You go to Romans 3:1 and then just select Darby. It's literally called just Darby translation. And you'll find this right there. This is all in the open. In fact, a lot of his works are out in the open, as I said before. And anyway, back to this. This is distinct from the King James Version of the Bible, which states that, "What advantage then hath the Jew?" So we note a distinction in the language, superiority versus advantage. Well, why is this so important? Well, superiority, well, that's a very distinct term, right? Superiority, while both are comparative words, superiority indicates an inherent betterment of one over the other, an inherent quality that is better than the other, right? There is something internal that is special. Whereas with advantage, there is no sort of indication of that. It's more neutral. It's just saying, one is just higher up than the other one, right? There's no sort of special property going on. And to really hone this down, if we look to the dictionaries of the time, for example, Richardson's New Dictionary of the English Language in 1863, which is around the time when Darby would have been working on this, it notes that superiority is meaning, or superior is meaning higher in rank, in quality, more eminent, more excellent, greater, better. So again, in quality. So there's no sort of excuse for Darby here. The only sort of rational response to this is that Darby has framed this in a certain way on purpose. There is some intention behind this. It's, unless Darby, for some reason, did not know of the meaning of superiority, which, that's a very unlikely scenario. Another sort of change to the Bible we can find in Ephesians, and it is that, so in order that we may no longer be babes, we may be no longer babes, tossed and carried about every wind of that teaching, which is in the sleight of men, in unprincipled cunning, with a view to systematized error. So again, that's the translation by Darby. And note, systemized error. Compare that with the King James Version, which states, they lie in wait to deceive. Deceive versus error. Again, these are two very distinct words. These are not synonyms in a way, right? These are two distinct words. Error would indicate a mistake, no maliciousness. Deceive indicates intent. The King James Version, and I believe other versions, include this sort of this word deceive, and that's the sort of meaning that's trying to be expressed here, is that there is an intention behind this deceit by these, I guess, cunning men. Whereas in Darby's translation, he's saying, oh no, it's an error, right? There's no malpractice going on, which is almost ironic when you think about it, because he does seem to be a cunning man who does seem to have these systematized errors, especially as we saw in the earlier quote. So yeah, it's an interesting point to note just some of his views here. And of course, these are not the only changes to the Bible. I have linked here a website that I found that includes many, many of these changes. Dozens of, I think probably more than 100 or something like that. And not just, small changes like changing the words, I don't know, child to baby or something like that, right? Like child to kid, right? These are distinct, almost doctrinal changes. Changes in framing, in an expression of the message that's trying to be expressed here. One other topic. Again, this topic isn't, well, I wouldn't discredit it and say it's not important, but I found that it doesn't sort of directly link across with things like Christian Zionism and American evangelicalism, which is that of theosophies and theosophical language. So this comes out of the occult, sort of satanic circles and things like that. So Darby himself uses terms such as the absolute and architect to refer to God. So again, these are sort of occult, satanic, Masonic terms, Freemasonry terms, used to refer to God. So again, it's an interesting spin to note on whether perhaps Darby had been influenced by the occult, but again, it's not something that will directly link over to Christian Zionism, as we'll see later. And again, I have another link to another list of the terms that Darby has used, and again, it's an extensive list of many, many examples. They don't even include all the examples as well. So I think that will be it today for today. Next time we'll look at the Scofield Study Bible, and we might look more at Darby if there's a sort of interest in that. But yeah, we'll look at the Scofield Study Bible, the relationship between Scofield himself and Darby, and how that sort of study Bible came about, and then perhaps we'll look at its influences and the spread of it. Thank you so much for, watching. I do have my references, of course, all listed. If you are interested, I can send these all over, but again, these are all here to note. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found this interesting.